And welcome to a absolutely fantastic episode of Dogma Debate. I'm so excited for this one because this is the guest I've been waiting for. I have Dr. Nancy Meyer, and she is a historian. Is that correct? Did I, or actually, let's just go ahead and introduce Dr. Nancy right off the top so she can say what she is, because I think she holds a number of degrees. Dr. Nancy, welcome.
Hi, I am a mythologist, ancient historian, and religionist.
Exactly. And she goes by Dr. Nan 2018 on TikTok. And I was watching one of her videos, which was so appropriate because she was talking about the historicity of Jesus and the lack of evidence that the lack of evidence that he lived the life the Bible says for sure, but it's question as to whether he lived at all. And I hear this all the time. Christians will write to me, they'll argue with me, they want to talk Josephus, they want to talk Tacitus. So I invited Dr. Nan on to have this conversation to find out what we actually know. And nobody would know better than her because she's got the PhD and I'm just a guy on TikTok. So thanks for coming to the show. What is the story about Jesus? What do we actually know about him?
Well, what do we actually know about him? That's a really good question. The possibility that he existed is certainly out there. But when I read the New Testament closely, like when I'm looking, or Josephus, when I'm looking at the people who surrounded him, they are, for lack of a better term, super Jews. Like they are potentially Qumran, Dead Sea Scroll kind of every law needs to be obeyed, right? Like incredibly uh I can't think of a better word, but like yeah, just incredibly law abiding based in the Hebrew
Adherent
Bible.
to the laws of the Old Testament,
Yes, exactly.
as contradictory as that may be, as difficult as that would be to do.
It's impossible,
Yeah.
right? Because the
Mhm.
number of laws is just insane.
Right.
But so this idea that Jesus has come to overturn the law, that he is and I love the way he's portrayed in the Gospels. Like, I know Christians who consider themselves new evangelical or red letter Christians. And as a faith, I'm all over it. I love it. It's beautiful. And I know some really wonderful people who are standing there going, no, you should not judge. We have to welcome the immigrant. We have to support the poor and et cetera. And as a faith, I greatly respect that. And I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that Christianity is not a unified monolithic thing.
Right.
But when we're talking about the historical Jesus, that's a different question. And like I said, the chances of him existing, pretty decent. The chances of him existing as he's portrayed in the New Testament, I would say, are pretty low.
Right. And I will point out, just because you talk about the red letter Christians, and can we just quickly give a definition of that? That's people who just go by what Jesus said. That is their religion. They don't adhere to the Old Testament. They go by the words of Christ. Is that a correct summation of what that is?
Yes. And
Right.
they're not even as worried about Paul.
Right.
They want to go back to what Jesus actually said, which is a really beautiful message.
Right. But did not Jesus not say, not a jot or tittle of the law will change until all is come to pass, which sounds like he's saying you have to still adhere to Old Testament law. So that is an interesting
Yeah.
needle to thread if you're going to be a red letter Christian and say you're ignoring the Old Testament. But that's not why we're here today. We're just talking about the historicity of Jesus, but that is an interesting side note.
Hmm.
So, many people will point to Josephus, and that is off the bat. That's flawed, right? And why don't you tell us why that is?
Well, we've only got Jesus discussed one time in Josephus, and it's pretty obviously interpolated, right? It's kind of like we're going to talk about making a sandwich, and then we're going to throw one or two sentences about making spaghetti, and then go back to the sandwich, right?
Right,
It's out of place. It's clunky. It's clumsy. It's just it doesn't belong there,
right,
and it's so perfect. It's like it's out of character for Josephus and the
right,
way he writes and the way he talks about people. So it's just it was obviously put in there much later.
right. And that's what you mean when you say interpolated, right?
In
And, right,
inserted into the text later on, yeah.
right, by somebody other than Josephus, somebody that
Yeah,
was trying to make Josephus's writings say something that they didn't actually say, is what we would, how we
right.
would right. And in addition, Josephus, if I'm not mistaken, was Jewish, right?
He was. He
Right.
was in Galilee during the siege of Palestine, right by Rome.
Right.
Uh, and he's a turncoat, but he totally acknowledges it.
He's a turncoat in what sense?
Well, he was supposed to be helping, during the siege of Galilee. He's supposed to be one of the guys there keeping the Romans out, and he and a
Oh,
bunch of his buddies are supposed to be working on that. And they agree that if it falls, that they're going to kill themselves. Uh,
wow.
he he draws the short straw, and when it falls, all of his buddies kill themselves, and he's like, "Well, maybe not," and he loses heart and he kind of goes out and he goes, "Oh, the star prophecy in Numbers, the King of Kings, I have seen it, I have seen it. It's Vespasian," right? The Emperor of Rome. And that saves his hide because Vespasian hears about this and he's like, "Okay, bring that guy with us. We're going to keep him in chains until something happens," right? Uh, but it saves him. And lo and behold, Nero dies. We get a few emperors, in succession after that because the empire's thrown into chaos, and the troops nominate or basically claim, proclaim Vespasian the next emperor, and that starts the Flavian dynasty.
That's so interesting. Vespasian, right, just from what you described there, sounds rather Trumpian in that kiss his ass and he's like, you know what, I like this guy. Hey, you know what? Not so bad. But the reason that I mentioned that he was Jewish is that one of the things that sticks out as not making sense is that he says about this time there lived a man named Jesus, a wise man. If deed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people. I mean, it sounds like he's saying the things that they said about Jesus were true, which if you believed that, it's kind of hard to be,
Yeah.
Jewish and believe that Jesus was the savior. So right off the bat, really out of place for a guy that extols the virtues of Judaism in all of his other writings.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly it. He's very practical. He's there, and one of the reasons, I get a lot of people going, "Oh, but Josephus isn't, really trustworthy for history because he's not a modern historian," and I'm like, none of them are, because they're not thinking about our values. Josephus, he is Jewish and he does love his people and his faith, but he is also a turncoat and he's out to save his own hide. And so when you're reading him, you have to keep in mind his bias, which is he's there to make the Jews, kind of look good, and he's there to make that battle with Rome look really good because then the Romans overcame this incredible, the incredible Jewish people. And on one hand, the archaeology does back some of that up,
How's
but
that? Just out of curiosity.
well, just because we know there's a lot going on at that time. We know that Jerusalem, like if you go to the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, uh,
Right.
that was built during the Second Temple period, and I mean, just the fortifications are amazing. And it's not a temple wall; it's actually a city wall. But you see those beautifully dressed, well-hewn stones, right? They fit together so well, and it's just a massive wall. And you imagine that going all the way around Jerusalem,
Right.
and Rome has to come in and just take it down, and they take down everything except that one portion. Uh, and then when you read it, when you see Masada, if you ever, I haven't been to the top yet because I didn't have the chance to do it when I was there, but it's quite a fortification, and for a small group of Jews to take that over, just the incredible tenacity
Yeah.
of those people, right? And the fact that they stood so long against Rome,
Hmm.
and the incredible war machine that Rome had become. I'm like, yeah, he's biased, but I'm like, but you gotta hand it to the Jews, man.
Oh,
You
yeah.
look away and say, oh, well, they were nothing. Rome brought in several legions to take them out, and they still would not capitulate, right?
Right.
And it's one of those things that, even at the time, they were fighting against each other. And Josephus does talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he talks about a fourth philosophy. And we know the Qumran community is out there, and the Qumran community is just, they take conservative, law abiding to whole new levels that
Really?
are
I don't know
crazy.
about them. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's the Dead Sea Scroll community. We don't really have a good name for them, but I'll give you an example. I think it's in Community Rule. I could be wrong, but there's one place where they're talking about it and they're saying, we're outside in the desert and we don't have women, and if the angels are among us, so
Wow.
we have to maintain this ultra purity. And it's like, if you got to go pee, you're going to have to walk a half a mile out into the desert to do that, because we can't have the impurity here.
Wow.
And they are extremely concerned about nighttime emissions.
Yeah.
So if you're a young man among that community, you got to,
The wet dreams.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wouldn't that be a succubus coming to them then? Is that where?
They could interpret it that way. It's not in
Yeah.
the Dead Sea Scrolls in
Yeah.
any way, but again, this is just another community that is super concerned with lawfulness.
Right.
And of course, at that time, with Rome coming down on you, and Rome had already been there for quite some time, and they have the memory of the Maccabees, the Hasmonean family that actually gave them independent rule for a short time. But with Rome's coming down, it does feel like the end of the world. Like,
I
you
bet.
better be prepared for the end of the world. And so they are very law abiding, and they're very concerned about how to, obey the laws and which laws are more important than other laws, etc. And so, along with this, we have a huge number of people claiming to be the Messiah.
Right.
Every street corner has a guy going, "Oh, I am the Savior," right? Um, and a lot of people are making claim to that prophecy in Numbers, the King of Kings prophecy, including the way it was applied to Vespasian. And
Interesting.
Jesus is just another one of them. And like, people come to me and they're like, "Oh, but Jesus is crucified, yada yada yada." And we know that, okay, if Jesus was crucified with three people, that was a great day because only three of them were crucified,
Interesting.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we know that the Romans do this a lot to people they don't like, and the Romans are like the original anti-Semites. They so hate the Jews, and the Jews won't give up. And Rome comes in and they're like, "Pay your taxes, keep the peace,
Right.
right, and honor the genius of the emperor." And the Romans are like, "Screw you guys, we're not giving you anything. We want independent rule again, and we don't honor anything outside of Yahweh," because by then they're strict monotheists.
Right.
Um,
Well, that's interesting you should say that because that does bring up a question, and I wanted to get into the dying and rising God that Jesus, the myth, becomes. But
mhm,
you say at that point they were strict monotheists, and this is something that I find very interesting, and I've looked into that it does seem from the earliest Jewish texts that they were not monotheists. That Yahweh Himself speaks of sitting on a council of gods among other gods. That
yeah.
Christians in particular try to explain this away now, but it does seem that the earliest Jewish texts were polytheistic. Is that correct?
Yeah, they are polytheistic, or I can't remember who coined the term. It wasn't Deaver, it was before Deaver, but there's another term called henotheism, where you're worshiping one god above other gods, but you're acknowledging other gods,
Right,
right? So, we have a long history of possible polytheism and definitely henotheism, and we see that in the prophets. And I suck at names and I can't remember exactly where this is, but I know we see the worship of Adonis. I want to say it's in Isaiah, might be in Ezekiel. Um, but we see the worship of Adonis. We see Asherah throughout the texts. Of course, we see
right.
Baal as a
Yeah,
nice foil for Yahweh, but
yeah,
they're not saying that Baal doesn't necessarily exist. They're just saying it's a false god, it's not our god. There's
right.
always tension with these other gods. And we also see, I was just doing a TikTok on a knot, in the Elephantine archive. I want to say it's fourth or fifth century BCE Egypt. right around one of the first cataract of the Nile. There was a temple that belonged to some Jews. They had built it and they were doing animal sacrifice there. And it gets destroyed by some local Egyptians. And they're writing to Jerusalem to get permission to rebuild their temple. And among the records, we see these tax receipts, and a Shum Bethel and a Not Bethel get taxes, and they get as much as Yahweh.
Hmm.
And we're not really sure exactly what this means because it looks like a not the house of El might be one translation. So we're not entirely sure what that means or if that's a full name or what, but they seem to be other deities that get taxes.
That's so interesting. Now, to me, it seems to make sense that it went from polytheism to monotheism, and it seems, and this is just in my very layman's terms, that it seems like the playground one-upmanship of my God is better than your God, to the
Yeah.
point where eventually you're going to get to, well, my God is everywhere, knows everything, and is the only God. Is, I mean, that
Mhm.
as gods were, I mean, because gods were in the polytheistic tradition were flawed.
Mhm.
They had their area of specialty, but there were other areas for which they were not specialized in, and another god took up that. And it seems to me as religion, which is, to say power and money, and has been traditionally, you tell me if I'm correct in that, it seems that as you're trying to say, my God is better than your God, you're going to eventually get to, my God is the only God, he knows everything, he's everywhere. Would you say that that is accurate, that that's what history shows, or that's just this silly man's interpretation of it?
Well, I think that might be a little oversimplification because
Yeah.
really the only the only really im- I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. We really only see monotheism coming out of the Middle East.
Right.
Right. We have, of course, Judaism, which is a later, monotheistic tradition, meaning that they go through polytheism, they seem to go through henotheism, and there seems to be a continued battle towards monotheism into the fourth century, maybe even later. Anytime you have prophets, etc., and you see this within the Hebrew Bible, they're constantly railing against people worshiping other gods because people are worshiping other gods.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Um, and we know that later on, we're looking at second century BCE on. We have a group called the Hangers Around the Temple. And these are people who are interested in this monotheistic thing, but that whole circumcision part,
Right.
uh, uh,
Yeah.
makes perfect sense. And I think this is one of the reasons Paul does this whole circumcision of the heart thing.
Right.
And then Christianity pulls that monotheism out of Judaism. And later on, and I'm going to say this at the risk of getting in trouble from other people, I think Islam also pulls that monotheistic idea out of Christianity that comes out of Judaism. And so
Interesting.
there's this lineage of the Abrahamic traditions that eventually become monotheistic based in Judaism, but none of the other traditions in the Middle East do this. None of the other, you can look at India, right?
Right.
Hinduism, they never come to that conclusion. And even if you're looking into, say, China and Japan, they never come to that conclusion.
Right.
So,
Might that be because they in India and China and Japan, there weren't the competing religions like there were in the Middle East, where it seems like there was a real marketplace of religions at that time?
no, I don't think so because I think in the Middle East, what you have is something similar to what you see in Hinduism, even is you have, people acknowledge all the other deities, but their deity or group of deities is this one, right? So if you're in Uruk, you've got Inanna, Ishtar is very important there, but also Nana and also Shamash. And if you're in Babylon, Marduk is definitely the king, but you still have the other deities. And some of these other deities are going to help you on a personal level. You may have a family connection. On a professional level, you may have a connection with your guild, or if you're one of the potters, you're going to go to this other deity. Um, so I don't think so, because Hinduism does something similar. You have Shaivites and Vaishnavites, and people who are focused on Shakti. You've got people who are focused on Ganesh, my buddy back there in the background, and yet they don't. That there's not really necessarily a competition for it.
Right.
It's just, this is your city's god, and this is who you tend to worship. But it's not. I'm not trying to take out the other gods unless I'm stealing them to show them that I have power,
I
that
see.
their god has abandoned them, right? And that's the whole taking of the image and getting it out of the city.
Mm.
But even there, we see, even though Judaism is very much anti icon, or iconoclastic, uh, the Ark of the Covenant becomes the kind of placeholder for the god, for the
Right.
god statue. So yeah, I'm not sure. The question of why they went towards monotheism so hard is a really good question, and I'm not sure we'll ever get an answer for it.
I see. And I mean, just from my own point of view, it seems that Christianity has a tough row to hoe in making the argument that they are monotheistic because, I mean, just
The
take
tr
the big 2, you got the God and the devil, that sounds like 2 right there, and then
Yeah,
you add in the angels, and I'm from the Catholic, tradition, that's what I came up in, and you got the saints that you can pray to, and it starts to sound very, with the Romans or the Greeks and, back to the polytheistic gods.
yeah.
I mean, it just seems like they called a polytheistic religion monotheism without actually making it a monotheism, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like it's all part of that salesmanship. And you said something very interesting, and because they were trying to sell it, and you talked about Paul, and you said the circumcision of the heart. And I know that the saying you don't have to be circumcised to become a Christian was a selling point. It was basically, a way of bringing in the pagans. But I hadn't heard that expression. What do you mean by circumcision of the heart?
Well, I'm pretty sure he actually uses that term.
Right.
You're making me question it now, but and I don't have time to look it up. But yeah, it's that idea that if you are a faithful, if you truly love the deity, Jesus or God, depending on how you parse
Yeah.
that theologically, then you don't have to do the physical mark. It's in your heart, kind of a thing.
You are circumcised in your heart. Oh, that's what a beautiful thought. Um, but you are a mythicist, so it
Mhm,
does raise the question, and I've heard this said so many times before, that Jesus's story is not a unique one. The idea of a dying and rising God. We've seen this so many times before.
mhm.
Uh, will you speak to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know I for a long time, and I can't even tell you why, because I wasn't raised with religion. My dad was a recovering Catholic by his own admission, and my mom was a very quiet Southern Baptist. And I grew up actually in neo paganism because my oldest sister, is 10 years older than I am. So she started taking me to a neo pagan, new age circle for when I was a teenager. Didn't have any connection to any church at all. But I was very angry at Christianity, pissed. Can't tell you why. And the mythology degree helped me kind of come to terms and understand it in a way that I was able to make peace with it. And part of that is this question of the dying and rising God and the internal kind of divine spark that we all have. And this, our fear of death is part of that. And the dying and rising God is kind of that message that you go on, and the
Right,
divine spark within goes on. And even the gods, when they encounter death, come back.
right,
Right. So Jesus dies, but he comes back. And especially because Jesus takes on this element of being human as well. Right.
right,
So again, it's that reassurance that death is never really truly the end.
right,
So Cyrus, dies, but is brought back by Isis, but eventually resides in the underworld as the god there. Odin dies but returns. Dionysus is torn apart by the Titans during the Titanomachy. Zeus takes his heart and gives it to Semele, and she drinks it somehow. In my head, she's drinking some weird smoothie. I don't know. Um, but she then becomes pregnant with Dionysus, and he becomes the god with two mothers.
Hmm.
And then he has another story where he goes into the underworld to get his mom Semele, and then comes back up with her through a lagoon or a swamp or something. So again, we have this kind of rebirth imagery. So our own concern with death, I think, is addressed with this dying and rising deity. That there is something that is eternal that can come back or is reborn in some other place or resides and lives in some other place.
Right. And you mentioned that, and this is a point I make again, you would know far better than me, but that, Christians will often say, well, Jesus, isn't it wonderful that he came and was just a man? To which I always say, well, actually, wasn't it convenient that he was just a man? Because you know who else was just a man? Everyone, absolutely everyone. And so it's all becomes almost impossible to tell the difference between the God that came back as just a man and the just average person claiming to be a God.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, we don't even have sufficient evidence to prove that Jesus even existed. And if he did, he was, I don't mean to be disrespectful to my Christian friends, but kind of a dime a dozen. The prophets roaming the hillsides of Jerusalem at that time, claiming to have a direct line to the Creator, they were there were many, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Like I said, when Rome is, kind of pressing down on that whole area, and they've had it with the Jews in Jerusalem, they've just had it with them. Um, yeah, the end of the world is coming, and there's lots of people trying to find hope in that mess, right? So we get lots of messianism in that time, and lots of people claiming to be the Messiah. Um, eh, I'm not sure why Jesus gets pulled out uniquely. I'm not sure. It could be because of Paul.
Right.
Uh, Paul has a first class Roman education, and he is well trained in rhetoric. And although he claims to be Jewish and part of the high priesthood, he's married to a daughter of a high priest or something, and he knows the Hebrew Bible. But when he gets charged, if we can believe the Bible, he gets charged because number one, he's got real conflict with the Jerusalem Council, and that's another point where I'm like, I don't think Jesus was originally this kind of overturn the law kind of guy. He's surrounded by people who are law abiding, and they don't like Paul.
Hmm.
They really don't like him. In Acts, every time Paul's got to go to Jerusalem, he's like, "Well, I'll get there next year. I'm gonna go to Cyprus or something, right?" Um, and then we also know that Paul has like incredible Roman citizenship, which the Jews were denied. Because when Paul goes into Jerusalem and he causes a big kerfuffle, they condemn him to death, and he makes an appeal to the emperor. No Jew gets to do
Oh yeah.
that. And then he gets put under house arrest in the palace of Agrippa. No one else gets to do that either, right? And then he also says, and I can't remember where it is. I want to say Second Corinthians, but again, it's been a while since I've been enmeshed in this material. He tells the whoever he's writing to, say hello to little Herodias for me.
Hmm. Who's little Herodias?
We're not really sure, but it's a Herodian name.
Right.
And the Herodians, although they make a claim to Judaism, are not Jews. They're actually Arabs. And Herod the Great marries Miriam, the last of the Maccabees, to legitimize his kind of membership among the Jews. And then she has several children with him before she passes away. So he's kind of Jewish,
Yeah.
but he's got some things going on here that I'm like, it's making me question you. Right?
Yeah.
It's making me ask some hard questions here because your credentials, the privilege that he has is a little beyond what any of the other Jews are going to experience.
Would you say then there's sufficient evidence that Paul was a real person?
I think so. I think so. We've got the at least 25 to 30% of those letters look like they're written by the same hand. New Testament scholars have gone in and looked at the linguistics, and et cetera. So First and Second Corinthians, Galatians, we've got some pretty good stuff from him. Whereas like Jesus never wrote about himself, and we
Right.
don't have anybody right around him saying, "I knew Jesus on this," in this month that we went to wherever. Um, we don't have anything like that for Jesus, but we do have Paul in his own words talking, and some of his letters are in question. Some are definitely not him, but there's pretty good standing for Paul. But again, he never met the guy.
Right. And what
As
were the condition what was I mean, we know he was Saul of Tarsus. He had his conversion on the road to Damascus.
yeah,
What exactly was that experience? That I mean, it was a vision in the sky?
you know what? I It's been a while since I've read that, so I don't want to quote it, but it's a mystical experience, right? He's having this vision, but I have issues with Paul.
Yeah.
I spent a year in England studying, and I was doing classics over there, but because I'm American, I decided to do religious studies as well, and I did this great class on the Corinthian correspondence. And I made peace with Paul there. I have great respect for him. He's a politician, though. He's a politician. He's claiming to have this incredible revelation of a very mystical figure of Jesus. And my conclusion was that I think that Paul, as a Roman, and he knows the Roman culture really well, he has a way to get into the royal household, right? He's got connections to the imperial family at the very least. And he's got connections to Judaism. And I came to the conclusion that Paul knows that Judaism is not going to survive under Rome. I don't think
Mm.
he thinks it has a chance. And because he knows Rome, he knows the power of Rome,
Right.
right? Um, and so I think what he sees is that Judaism is going to die. And I think he creates a form of Judaism that the hangers around the temple, that the people who are attracted to like the cult of Isis, um, that they can come to, and a form of the faith that will survive Roman rule.
And that's what Christianity is?
I think that's what Pauline Christianity is.
Interesting. I have not heard that before. That is absolutely fascinating. But as we're talking about the people that we have evidence for, we've covered Jesus a little. I want to get back to him, but when it comes to uh, the Gospels, these
Mhm.
we have pretty sufficient evidence that they were not written by the person whose name is attributed to each one. Would you say that that's correct?
Oh yeah, and that's common in the ancient world.
Right.
We have all these letters by Paul that were not his.
Right.
This is very common. You write something and you put it in the name of someone that people are going to know, so they'll read it.
Right.
It's
So
not considered plagiarism.
but do we have any evidence that any of the apostles existed? Is there any historical evidence of their actual existence? I know they didn't write the gospels.
Yeah. I think the we've got a guy named James,
Right.
right?
Brother of
Uh,
Jesus, so to
uh,
speak,
Possibly,
possibly.
probably, like I said, in Josephus, there's James who's in Jerusalem at that time, and but again, he's a super Jew.
Yeah.
He is obeying all the laws as much as humanly possible. And I love that Josephus says he has the knees of a camel because they're so calloused from being in the temple and praying for the people.
Right.
Um, we've got, I'm trying to think of it. It gets real dodgy because the names are very common.
Right.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
As common
There
as they are today, going into
Yeah,
Los Angeles where I live and saying, "I know Luke. Anyone? Can you direct me to Luke? John?
right.
John?" Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So
many Christians will tell you that one of the proofs of Jesus's life and that the proof of the claims about Jesus is that these apostles all willingly went to their deaths, which I find very unconvincing anyway, because
yeah,
we have plenty of religious zealots willing to go to their deaths for religions that a Christian will tell you is a false religion. So obviously, that's not proof of the truth of their claims, but they will
right.
tell you that they all went to their deaths. Why do they say that? Is there historical evidence that they went to their deaths, or is it just written by Christians hundreds of years later that they went to their deaths?
Yeah, I think it's just written by Christians, years later. Once you get past the first century, right? We're talking about a game of telephone, second, third, fourth hand accounts. Um, so as an ancient historian,
Right,
I have not found any good data to support that.
right.
As an article of faith, rock on.
Sure.
And I sit here, I do have my own faith. I'm generally Buddhist. Um, I don't belong to a temple or anything, but you pull inspiration out of the mythology, and it's okay that it's mythology. It doesn't have to be history. When I'm thinking about the sutras, or the story of the Buddha, or when I'm thinking about Kuan Yin, my other painting back there by my husband, um, I'm not worried about it being history. I am thinking about, how does this inspire me to be a better person?
Right,
How does this faith ask me to do the hard things of forgiving, not necessarily forgetting, but being at peace with who people are in this moment, right? And be a better, more kind person.
absolutely. And I support that 100%. But when
Yeah,
it comes to fundamental Christians in this country who want to legislate their
yeah,
Christianity, it kind of hinges on this story being true and
yeah.
the fact that the evidence is scant at best. Let me
At
ask you
best.
this. Were there historians, as we call them, although they wouldn't fit the mold of what we call a historian today,
Mhm.
around the time of Jesus writing about other prophets, and they just happen to miss Jesus? I mean, I've read that before, where it's like, if he was real, this guy who was writing about prophets in Jerusalem at that time probably would have noticed him, and yet we have all this guy's writings, and he wrote about this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy. Never
Mhm.
mentions Jesus.
You know what? That's kind of a number one. Anytime you say, "Oh, a historian was writing," the best we've got is like Josephus, right? And even
Right,
there, we've got incredible bias, and he is not taking account of his own biases. And that's kind of the definition of modern historians, right? Looking for data, taking account of your own biases.
right, yeah,
That constant search for what is my bias. Nobody in the ancient world is doing that,
right,
right? They're recording things as they understand them, or as they want them to be recorded.
right,
Um, and the other thing you have to consider is you have to consider the possibility that later people within the early church even went back and edited, redacted, cut out completely things that didn't work for them.
right.
So, one of the interesting things you see in the New Testament is the number of people named Mary.
Mm,
Why? Right? I think there's like four or five of them. And one of my professors many years ago posited that, it could be that they were put in there that way to be confusing. Um, we should have the acts of Pilate. We don't. Is it possible that they were burned, gotten rid of because they didn't report what was needed at the time? And one of the things you have to come to terms with, in religious studies in general, is Religion is a political and economic force. It always has been, it always will be. As soon as you have a temple, you have economics because you have
Right.
distribution and redistribution of goods.
Absolutely.
Kingship descends at Eridu, right? For Mesopotamian kings, it all goes back to the temple. So when you're looking at things like in I think 323 or 325, Constantine suddenly converting to Christianity, him and his bishop Eusebius pulling together the New Testament, it's a political document because they're trying to create a united faith
Hmm.
that didn't exist. And I think one of the misnomers that Christians are kind of, or at least that evangelical Christians are suffering under, is this idea that there was a original faith that was based on some kind of history. Number one, getting back to that history is going to be impossible. Number two, there was never a united faith. Maybe while Jesus was alive, but now we're back to that problem of who was Jesus.
Right.
No idea. And number three, and I just mentioned this on one of my TikToks, um, as soon as the founder dies, across the board, if you can point to the founder, the minute that founder dies, the faith splits,
Right.
right? And we see this in Buddhism. We see this very clearly in Islam.
Right.
The prophet is not even buried, and the faith has split.
The
And we have,
Sharia Sunni split.
yeah. Um,
And
so,
when you speak of the kings and the people, the later Christians writing, and very often, and just on my quick list of other ancient mentioners of Jesus, we have Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, I believe. And when you read the writings, they're just all they do is mention that Christians existed. They don't mention that Jesus existed. But as far as the Christian writers in the first and second century, we see, and you just mentioned this, a motivation for them to bolster the claims of Christianity, and that is that political and financial power that comes to them
yeah,
with a stronger religion, you know? I mean, and you have to look at motivation, and you talk about historians looking for their bias. We have to look at the bias of the people writing these things, you know?
sure.
And
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just yeah, that was it.
Well, I think what's interesting is, and I had, on that one TikTok that I did about Jesus, a lot of people coming back, well, Tacitus, and I'm like, okay, Tacitus is reporting what people told him.
Right,
That's all he's doing, and Pliny the Elder is doing something very similar. He is reporting. Um, they're not they're not claiming to be eyewitnesses. They're not claiming that it's accurate or true. They're just saying, here's what people are telling me about who they are and what they believe.
right.
Hmm.
And the eyewitness accounts that people will point to in the Bible, I mean, I don't even know where to begin to address the problems with that.
Yeah.
This one source says 500 people witnessed this thing that Jesus did.
Hmm.
Doesn't give names. We have no way of meeting these people, interviewing these people. It's just an anonymous person. We don't know who wrote it. An anonymous person saying a bunch of anonymous people saw this thing happen. That
Yeah.
is the furthest thing from eyewitness accounts as I mean, try bringing that to a court of law, much less to a scientific laboratory,
Yeah.
as evidence. I mean, it's just not gonna hold up. But, you know, in the United States of America, again, we talk about religion. It is a political force,
Yeah.
and there is a power that comes with that that they are trying to bolster.
Yeah. And I think, I actually, one of the things I'm working on in my own research is I'm trying to find the historical antecedents of the Eucharist. Because eating your deity, that engagement of even metaphorical or symbolic cannibalism, is just weird.
Super weird, and it's not metaphorical where I come from. I'm Catholic. It's literal. We're
Yeah,
eating God. Yep.
transubstantiation, but it's just an oddity, and throughout the ancient world, cannibalism is taboo,
Mm.
right? And at least within the Greco-Roman period, and including in the Levant. So where is this coming from? And what I'm looking at is in the research so far is looking at how religion and ritual, especially within Rome, is a political force. You engage in the ritual, you engage in the festival, because that signals your presence in the Roman community. So as Rome spreads, they're very good about, hi, we're here. And again, keep the peace, pay the taxes, honor the genius of the emperor, keep speaking your language, keep practicing your own religion, rock on, hope the farming goes well because we got taxes.
Yeah.
Um, but that participation in the ritual, even just the honoring, of the emperor, marks you as a Roman, and marks is a civic and cultural marker. So when the Christians decide not to engage that, it is itself, that is not just an act of faith, that's a political act.
Right.
And that's what Tacitus and Pliny and the empire in general, as they are dealing with, this Christian thing, that's what they're dealing with. They're these people who don't want to be Roman in any way, shape, or form. And that's what they're getting in trouble for, is they're not engaging the body politic in that symbolic level. And so, like you said, people are talking, you're talking about Christianity, and there's this need to show that it's historical because there's a political motivation, but they don't want to acknowledge that politics, the
Right.
political side of it. And that's the part where I'm kind of going, but you're absolutely using this as a political tool.
Yeah.
And you're using, and the thing that really bothers me is the insistence that they're victims.
Oh,
And they go back to this Roman period where we were so persecuted, and I'm like, Pookie, Christians were no more persecuted than anybody else. Yes,
right.
Nero picked on you, but Nero picked on a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right? Lots of people were persecuted by the Romans, and Pookie, you're not being persecuted now. We're not
No.
here to take away your Bible, and we're not here to tell you can't practice. I am here to tell you that you don't get to tell me what to do.
Right. And I mean the cry of persecution is more than ridiculous when you look at the number of churches in America and the number of politicians that give lip service, if not just bow down to the churches. The fact that every president swears on a Bible, I mean, they're the furthest thing from persecuted. By the persecuted, they mean we don't get to persecute you. That's so damn persecuting of you. Like,
Yeah,
we should be allowed to put the 10 commandments in school. And you said, no, we're persecuted.
right.
We should be allowed to pray in school, which, by the way, they are allowed to pray in school. I always point that out. You can pray as much as you want. You just can't force me or my kids to pray in school. And as far as the abortion debate goes, I mean,
Oh, I
forget
can't.
about it. Now we're
Yeah.
legislating your morality onto
Mhm.
us based on a book which you can't even prove is true. And it does, their religion does kind of rise or fall on the truth of this story. If it didn't happen, you kind of have nothing. You talk about being a Buddhist and, the story of Prince Siddhartha, if he didn't exist, the teachings are still wise.
Yeah.
Uh, One way or the other. If Socrates didn't exist, somebody wrote these things down and they're worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. But if Jesus didn't exist, you got nothing. I mean, you could
Yeah.
say his words are still wise, but as far as the fervent adherence to your faith, that's going to fall apart. So they kind of need to make it to be true. And that's
Right.
the
Well,
world we live in.
and I think the whenever somebody comes to me and they're talking about, well, this is, the most important truth, or this is the biggest truth, and you have to be Christian or whatever. My question is always, what is your metric? How do you know this is the one religion, the true religion? How are we measuring this, right? What is your metric? If your metric is age, well, you've lost.
Big time.
Buddhism is older, Hinduism is older, Judaism is older. Okay.
I think Zoroastrian's older too.
Absolutely. Well, if we're going to go into religions that are marginally practiced or
Yeah.
dead, then
Yeah.
we've got we've most of human history behind us.
Yeah.
If your metric is the best accounted for historically, then you've lost to Islam.
Yep.
Islam is more recent and is more historically kind of
Yeah.
accounted for.
Mormonism,
Mormonism.
we got the arrest records of Joseph Smith. That's not saying much about your religion, but he definitely existed.
If you're, so like, what is your metric? Is it the amount of literature? Is it, and the metric ends up being, well, it's my own personal, I believe it's true. And I'm like, okay,
Right,
but what other texts have you read?
right,
Have you read the sutras? Have you read the Vedas? Have you taken a look at the Mahabharata? Have you read the Quran? Have you read, fill in the blank? Have you even read Homer?
right,
You know, if you haven't explored another tradition, it's like me saying blue is the best color, but I don't know any other colors.
right,
This doesn't it doesn't make any sense.
right. That's such a great
Um,
analogy. You know,
so that's one of the things that just
right, and then you take the geography into it, and you're like, "What a coinky dink. You were born into a community where everyone believed this thing, and if you go to another community where everyone believes something else, they believe it as much as you believe your thing." It's almost as if people just it strengthens the bonds of your community, you know?
Mm,
And that is a motivation. We are a tribal animal, and this
sure.
community is important, and you don't want to go against the community. You don't want to be ostracized. You don't want to be sent out of the camp for peeing or having a wet dream or not believing or whatever it is. You know,
Exactly.
you don't want these things.
Yeah.
One more proof that Christians will give me, and this one is particularly weak, but we should discuss it for a moment anyway, is the archaeological evidence, which is to say that this town that was mentioned in the Bible turns out to have really existed. Do you want to speak to that for a moment? And I know that that's a pretty easy one.
You know what? And this is something else I address a couple of times in my talks is when you've proven one point, that doesn't prove 10 other points, right? Um, just because Nazareth exists doesn't mean that anything you said about Nazareth exists. And it's kind of like, if you watch Sense and Sensibility or any other period piece movie, it takes place in a real place, but it doesn't mean the characters are historically accurate,
Sure.
right? And this is another place where I see a lot of religious people get very excited, and I see headlines all the time, oh, they found something in Jerusalem. It proves King David existed. And I'm like, no, 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 no. It proves that some people were there, and it proves, it may prove 1 or 2 points, but you've got to find that intersecting data, and that's what Christianity misses. They have single points of data, but they never have intersections of data.
Right.
And Galilee existed,
Yeah.
Nazareth existed, Bethlehem existed. Um, these places existed, but it doesn't tell me anything about what happened there.
Right. 2,000 years from now, archaeologists might prove New York City existed. Doesn't mean Spider-Man was real.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And on that same token, we can prove that Trump existed, but that doesn't mean the Home Alone movie is a full account, right?
Yeah.
Trump appears in all kinds of shows and stuff in the 80s and 90s, but that doesn't mean that Mad
Right.
About You is a chronicle of someone's real life,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? And so that's another, yeah, exactly. It's another place where I really struggle with people sometimes because I remember I think it was the 90s or the very early 2000s, there was a bone box, an ossuary that was discovered
Right.
from someone,
James.
yeah, his personal collection, James, the brother of Jesus.
Yeah.
And immediately when it came out, we all got together. I was a student at the time with my professor, and we all said, number one, this is too easy.
Yeah.
Archaeology doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Number two, even in the newspaper photo, I'm like, the patina on part of that is wrong. And the writing is weird. And like it has certain writing here, and it's different writing.
Yeah.
It's Aramaic. And of course, it turned out to be false. But I remember a lot of people going, oh, this proves Jesus existed. And therefore, everything we said about him must be true as well.
Right.
And I'm like, even if you can prove that Jesus existed, all you're proving is that the person was biologically there.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely. And it brings up a really interesting point, which gets me to my next thing that I was just thinking, which is what you had there was almost certainly a Christian trying to make it true.
yep.
Somebody so fervently, cultishly believed that this thing is true that they were implanting fake evidence to make it true.
Yeah.
Which gets me to my next question, because you are a mythicist and we'd cover politics on this show too. And I want to know, do you see a myth in the making with Donald Trump? And this very week, we have Donald Trump says they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. And now we have Trump supporters trying to make that true as well,
Mhm.
grabbing random pictures of, whatever. I saw one of a guy with some geese that they're claiming was proving something, and it turned out he was actually a city employee. But do you, as somebody who studies myths, see that Donald Trump himself could be a modern myth in the making? That
Oh,
he's
I
already taken on mythological aspects?
absolutely. And I think, for my own definition, and this is, one of the things that you discover when you study religion and mythology is that there's no definition for either one of those things. There's no final definition that we all agree on. So when I'm thinking about mythology, I'm thinking about narratives that are identity building and identity maintaining. So very often, and this is another place where I struggle with people, because you can have a historical narrative that's accurate, and it can also be mythic. So the narrative can function in both spaces, right? And my problem comes when you have mythic narrative that gets mistaken or mislabeled historical. Donald Trump has become part of the American mythology, and he did this over a long period of time by appearing in TV and movies and whatnot. So he is part of that mythology. How that narrative is going to turn out, I don't know, but I think it's kind of like Nazism. That's part of the German identity as far as their historical narrative. That's part of their shadow.
Right, yeah,
Right. And I think Donald Trump is going to be part of the mythology, the identity building narrative. This is what our shadow looks like.
right,
Capitalism unfettered, wealth worshiped, fame worshiped, and all of the stories that come out of his mouth, or JD Vance at this point, or Laura Loon, or whatever her name is.
Loomer.
Thank you. I always want to say Looney, but I know that's
Yeah.
not right.
It's no,
Uh,
it's actually more accurate than her actual name.
right? Um, but all of the stories that come out of his mouth, those are mythic to his followers. And I've been calling his people a cult for years now. Even back in 2016, I'm like, as a religionist, I'm not throwing this word around needlessly. As a religionist, this is a cult.
Right,
This is a full on Jim Jones, Heaven's Gate, you name it, this is a cult. And so, just like any charismatic leader, everything he says becomes part of the identity of his followers.
right. And we even see that the martyrs are starting to come out of the movement. Ashley Babbitt comes to mind immediately, but all the J6 patriots, or whatever he calls them now, heroes,
Yeah.
they're
Oh, yeah.
becoming the martyrs. And, although people flip their wigs when, you compare MAGA to the Nazis, that is exactly what one of the things that the Nazis needed was, after Night of the Long Knives, I believe it was, or was it Beer Hall Pushed, but a certain number of Nazis were killed and they became the martyrs of the movement, and their
Yeah.
blood and their sacrifice was something that you then became worth fighting for. And now we're seeing that with like this Ashley Babbitt woman who, I mean, any objective person looking at what happened there as they smashed their way through the Capitol, trying to get to the floor of the House,
Yeah.
smashing windows violently. And one of the Capitol guards, tasked with protecting our Congress people, as she
Mhm.
came through the final barrier, shot her as a reasonable person would do. No, he was wrong. She was right. She is was an innocent martyr fighting for America, and we can see that in the face of contrary evidence, the narrative goes on with the cult, you know, and it does feel to me like this could be the beginning of the next religion almost. I mean, Trump is taking on a religious role.
Oh, he absolutely is, and his followers have I have seen him called a savior.
Yeah,
I have seen his misdeeds justified because David was an a-hole, so is Trump, but God favored David.
yeah.
And this is another narrative that people don't like. David is awful, right? David, Bathsheba, and he's just Michal. He's just awful. He's just terrible.
Didn't
Here,
David take payment in foreskins at one point, or is that someone else?
oh yeah, with the Philistines,
Yeah,
there was Hill of Foreskins, and but Michal, she's the daughter of Saul. He marries her, and she saves his life. She puts the teraphim, the household idols, puts like wool on their head so it looks like hair. She puts them in the bed so that when Saul comes for him, or Saul's people come for him to kill him as a competitor, they're like, let's get him out so that Saul's reign is solid. She lowers him out of the house. She gets him out the window, lowers him in a basket down the wall, and he takes off. She never hears from him again.
hmm.
Right. Later on, she's married again. He sends somebody to come collect her as his wife, brings her to Jerusalem, and then he is dancing through the streets and apparently exposing himself with the Ark of the Covenant. And she tells him, dude, stop this. He sends her to a corner and she disappears from the text. Bathsheba, of course, that is seems to be a rape narrative. But he is constantly, just awful. And one of the things I do that is very interesting to me is that the word that is used to describe how Michal feels about David is ahav, love.
Hmm.
And that same word is used when David talks about Jonathan or Yehonatan. David ahav Yehonatan. So there's some really interesting stuff going on there.
Wow.
but but yeah, and I'm sorry, I forgot our original
It was
point.
about Trump, but, that became so
Okay,
interesting anyway.
thank you.
And it gets me
Yeah,
to my final point, I guess,
yeah,
which was one last question I had, which I heard that, as the as the gospels are laid out in the Bible, they are not
yeah.
chronological. It's not in order of, which one was written first. And
Mhm,
that if you do line them up, I don't remember the order. I have it written down here somewhere. You might well know it,
mhm,
which one was written first, first to last. If you do line them up, the story of Jesus just gets more and more fantastical, which gets to
mhm,
that game of telephone we were talking about. You know, the more the story was told, the more fantastic Jesus becomes.
yeah. Well, you have the synoptic gospels. Mark is actually written first, and then Matthew and Luke. And it looks pretty evident that Matthew and Luke have Mark in front of them when they're writing, because we get passages that are directly quoted, right? And Burton Mack, back in like the 90s, did some work on this and developed the theory of Quella, or the Gospel of Q, that there is some
Right.
pre gospel to Mark that's like some proto gospel. But again, you can't really prove it. But the synoptic gospels, Luke and Matthew both have Mark in front of them. They do have the letters of Paul, and theologically, you can see Paul's kind of theology working through there as well. And in Mark, you have the messianic secret. They say you're the Messiah, they say you're God, and Jesus is like, well, is that what they say? Hmm.
Hmm.
Or are you? And they, well, what does everybody call me, right? He's not so much willing to confirm that he is the Messiah or that he is God or anything like that. And yet we do get that confirmation later in Luke and Matthew. And then John is like a Gnostic gospel. John is a completely out there. It's second century, early second century. But I think what you have there is you've got Eusebius and Constantine, who are responsible for the New Testament for the most part, trying to create that united Christianity, trying to create a Christianity or a group of texts that everybody can kind of get behind. And so you see the three synoptic gospels, they kind of belong together. There's some details that they differ on, but then John is very Gnostic. And so that's I think an attempt to bring in those Gnostic Christians.
Interesting. And in closing, I'll just say that to wrap both of those two threads we had, so I
Hmm.
guess both the Christian movement and the MAGA movement have a mysterious Q out there somewhere.
Yeah, they do. They do. Good call. Good call.
Well, Dr. Dan, thanks so much for being a part of Dogma Debate today. We really appreciate you. We thank you so much. And everybody go follow her. It's Dr. Nan 2018 on the TikTok.
Yes.
Thank you much.
And I'm out there talking about humanities and liberal arts in general. So there's also some other stuff on there.
Other things I like and need. Thanks.
All right.
All
Absolutely.
right.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.